This is Chapter 2, Neuroscience and Biological Foundations, Part 1. Okay, and as you notice within the assignments, you'll find that there will be these Mythbusters that's true and false. So I'm not going to try to go over them here, but I want you to try to go over them in the assignment. So please make sure that you answer these questions for yourselves. You could take a moment now if you would like, just to take a look at it so that you can kind of be aware. Uh, Go ahead and do your reading because you will find the answers within the chapter as you're doing the reading. So I will go ahead and move forward. We're going to start talking about our genetic inheritance. So when we're talking about behavioral genetics, we're talking in terms of the hereditary code. Here, this is where it's the study of the relative effects of genetic and environmental influences that's on behavior and mental processes. Okay? Genes are one of the most important basic building blocks of our biological inheritance. Each of our human characteristics and behaviors are related to the presence or the absence of particular genes, which control the transmission of our traits. For some traits, such as blood type, there's a single pair of genes, one from each parent. This helps to determine what characteristics we will possess. But most traits are going to be determined by a combination of many genes. So how do genes work? When we talk about dominant genes, when there's two genes of a given trait of conflict, the outcome would depend whether the gene is going to be a dominant or a recessive. A dominant gene reveals its trait whenever the gene is going to be present. However, in contrast, the gene for a recessive trait will normally be expressed only if the other gene in the pair is also recessive. So one example I can give of that is if we talk about sickle cell anemia. With sickle cell anemia, that is a recessive gene. And both parents would have to have that recessive gene for their offspring to actually get sickle cell anemia. Now, it was once assumed that characteristics such as eye color, hair color, or height were the result of either one dominant gene or two paired recessive genes. But today, geneticists believe that these characteristics are more polygenetic, okay? And that's meaning that they're controlled by multiple set of genes. Many polygenic traits, like our height or our level of intelligence, are also going to be affected by environmental as well as social factors. Fortunately, though, most serious genetic disorders are not transmitted through a dominant gene. Think about why that might be. So we all know that we talk about diet and exercise and how it can help us to live longer and healthier. For many of us, that's easier said than done. Will there ever be a drug that can help us stay young? Well, there have been reports that there's hope and that there are scientists working on seeing whether or not there's a key to a long life that can be found within one single gene. Now taking a look at methods of studying heritability. Heritability is the measure of the degree to which a characteristic is related to a genetic inherited factors versus the environment. How do you think scientists research human inheritance, though? To be able to determine the relative influences of heredity or environment on complex traits like aggressiveness or our intelligence or even social ability, scientists is going to rely more on studies that would involve twins, families, as well as some type of genetic abnormalities. So when we're speaking about twin studies, they've been able to provide a wealth of information on the relative effects of heredity uh, as far as when we're speaking about behavior. So for one example, studies of intelligence show that identical twins, monozygotic, have almost identical IQ scores, whereas fraternal twins, dizygotic, are only slightly more similar in their IQ scores than our non-twin siblings. Okay, this difference suggests basically a genetic influence on intelligence. Methods of studying heritability, we continue with this by looking at the fact that psychologists, they're interested in behavioral genetics. We also study entire families with biological and or adopted children. If there's a specific trait inherited, blood relatives should show increased trait similarities compared with unrelated people, and closer relatives, like siblings, should be more similar than distant relatives. Family studies have shown that many traits, as well as mental disorders such as intelligence and social ability or depression, they would actually run within family lines. In addition to other family studies, there's also been studies of families with adopted children, which have been able to provide unique different type of advantages. So in the slide here, you can see where it's talking about how shared genes as well as a shared environment from the biological parents as well as the adoptive parents being able to show some type of influence on behaviors. Okay, genetic factors would have the greater influence on a particular trait, such as if we talked about depression, or if we talked about the level of aggressionness, but the environmental factors, which would come from the adoptive family, would also have a greater influence on that trait. Now, misconceptions about genetics. Findings from these three type of methods have been able to allow us to see how behavioral geneticists estimates the heritability of various traits. That's to the degree that there are individual differences that will be a result of genetic inherited factors rather than differences in the environment. If genetics contributed nothing to the trait, it would have a heritability estimate of 0. If a trait was completely due to genetics, it would have, well, a heritability estimate of 100%. Keep in mind, though, that the heritability estimates applies to groups, not particularly individuals. So just remember that with genetic traits that are not fixed or inflexible, our lifestyle and environmental factors can influence whether these genes will be expressed. And again, heritability estimates are about more groups, not particularly individuals. And the estimates that we come to, again, would be at least particular trait can be 50%. And that's only applied to the populations, so groups, not individual people. Genes and environment are inseparable, and that again is because genes and the environment, it affects one another, and it's kind of impossible to separate the influences of each. So basically, biology is not purely the destiny of how we are as human beings. It's a combination. Evolutionary psychology. This stems from the writings of Darwin, who suggested that natural forces selected traits that are adaptive to the organism's survival. This process of natural selection occurs when a particular genetic trait gives an organism a reproductive advantage over others. Some people mistakenly believe that natural selection means survival of the fittest. But what really matters is reproduction. That is the survival of the genome. Because of natural selection, the fastest or otherwise most fit organisms will most likely live longer and long enough to reproduce as well as pass on their genes to the next generation. Genetic mutations also help to explain behavior. Everyone likely carries at least one gene that has been mutated or has been changed from this original origin. It's rare that a mutated gene will be significant enough, though, to change an individual's behavior. It might cause someone to be more social, could be more risk taking, they might be more shy or more cautious. If the gene then gives the person a reproductive advantage, he or she will be more likely to pass on the gene to future generations. However, this mutation doesn't guarantee long-term survival. A well-adapted population can perish if its environment changes too rapidly. Now we're going to start taking a look at neural bases of behavior. Starting with the building blocks of the brain. Your brain and the rest of the nervous system essentially has neurons. And each one is a tiny information processing system. Think of it as a real tiny little computer. Okay? And this tiny information processing system will have thousands of connections for receiving as well as sending electrochemical signals to the other neurons. Each human body may have as many as 1 trillion neurons. Yes, write that down, mark it somewhere in your book, because it probably will be a test question. But as many as 1 trillion. Be careful, though, not to confuse the term neuron with the term nerve, because we're not talking about nerves. Nerves within itself have neurons, okay? Because nerves are basically large bundles of axons that's outside of the brain as well as in the spinal cord. Now, neurons are held in place and supported by glial cells, and this makes up approximately 90% of the brain cells. They'll supply nutrients and oxygen, and they perform cleanup tasks. It does insulation to one nerve from one nerve to another so that the neural messages are not going to be scrambled up. This is what helps filter the information for the brain. Additionally, they'll play a direct role with our nervous system communication. Know that, though, even with that being said, the star of the communication will still be considered the neuron. Okay? So let's take a look at the parts of the neuron. No two neurons are going to be alike, but most of them will share these three basic features. Those three being dendrites, the cell body or soma, as well as the axon. To be able to remember how this information travels through the neuron, I want you to take time and think about these three in reverse alphabetical order. Think about the dendrite to the cell body to the axon. A neuron's basic function is to transmit information through the nervous system. Neurons are going to speak in a type of electrical and chemical language, and this process of neural communication will start with the neuron itself. When the dendrites in the cell bodies receive electrical messages, these messages will move along the axon in the form of a neural impulse, or, and remember this or, an action potential. Now, nerve impulses will move much slower than electricity would through a wire. A neural impulse travels along a bare axis at only about 10 meters per second, whereas electricity is going to move about 36 million meters per second. There are some axons, however, that are enveloped in a fatty insulation, and that fatty insulation is called the myelin sheath. This sheath helps blankets the axon, with the exception of those periodic nodes, as you can see in the slide. Okay, those points at which the myelin is very thin or absent. In a myelinated axon, the nerve impulse actually moves about 10 times faster than it would within a bare axon. And that's because the action potential, neural impulse, jumps from node to node rather than traveling along the entire axon. Now, the process of neural communication. Here it begins with the neuron itself, when the dendrites in the cell body receive information that travels down the entire length of the axon by way of brief traveling electrical charge, which again is called that action potential. It can be described in 3 steps, which you can see here in the slide. As you see in this slide, this sequential process would be called depolarization, and then it's followed by repolarization. This is when it's transmitting the action potential along the entire length of the axon from the cell, excuse me, from the cell body to the terminal buttons. This is similar to an audience at an athletic event. Say you're going to the Tigers football game and they're doing their best and they're doing great, and the audience the fans, they start to do the wave. That's where one section would start and they stand up for a brief moment. Think of that time as that action potential, and in this selection they'll sit down. That sit down time, think of that as being what we call a resting potential. And then that wave starts to get into the groove. That's when it spreads to the adjacent type of sections. All right. So communicating within the neuron is not the same as communication between neurons. Within the neuron, this message travels electrically, but messages that are transmitted chemically from one neuron to the next, those chemicals that's transmitted is called neurotransmitters. Now, when an action potential reaches the branching axon terminals, it's going to trigger these terminal buttons that you can see here on the slide, and it's giving you a nice little picture of that. But it's going to hit those terminal buttons at the axon's end to open and release thousands of these neurotransmitters into what we call a synapse. And that's those tiny openings that's going to be between, that'll start sending as well as receiving for the neurons. These chemicals will then move across the synaptic gap as well as attach to the membranes of the receiving neuron. In this way, what they're doing is they carry that message from the sending neuron onto the receiving neuron. Each receiving neuron will get multiple neurotransmitter type of messages. Neurotransmitters will deliver either excitatory or inhibitory messages. And the receiving neuron will only produce an action potential and then pass along the message if the number of excitatory messages will outweigh those inhibitory messages. Given that some neurons will have thousands of receptors, which are only responsive to specific type of neurotransmitters, pretty much what will happen is to excess neurotransmitters, or to those that don't fit into those adjacent receptor sites, the sending neuron normally will reabsorb the excess, and this is called reuptake, or it'll be broken down by special enzymes. Now, talking a little bit more about how neurotransmitters affect us, pretty much neurotransmitters are those chemicals that neurons are going to release, which will affect other neurons. So if you take a look at the slide, what it is giving you a list of some of the neurotransmitters that we see in many actions that occur as far as communications within neurons, as well as it shows what actions are going on in the brain. Okay, so with acetylcholine, and we just break that down to say ACH, here, this neurotransmitter is going to be responsible more for our muscle action, our ability to remember, learning, even with our sleep. And we talk about rapid eye movement. And don't worry, we have a whole chapter on that alone. So I'll go more into that later. But it helps with sleep, how we feel, and our emotions. Research has demonstrated that decreased acetylcholine actually is a suspect as far as for Alzheimer's disease. When we talk about dopamine, this also has involvement, and let me stop right here. You're going to find that although I'm talking about these individual neurotransmitters, sometimes they have double duty. You'll see an overlap of different responsibilities and how they relate to one another. However, going back to dopamine, it's in help with movement. It helps with attention. It helps our memory. It helps us in terms of how we learn. It helps in terms of our emotion. Research has been able to demonstrate that too much dopamine has been associated with the mental disorder of schizophrenia, whereas too little dopamine has been associated with Parkinson's disease. Okay, it also has been able to demonstrate a role with addictions, as well as how we feel in regards to when we're rewarded for something. Now, endorphins, and many people may know about endorphins, but this revolves around how our mood is, when it changes or shifts. Uh, Discussion in terms of how we feel for pain, again, memory, learning. It helps with our blood pressure, our appetite, as well as sexual arousal. Epinephrine, and many of you know it more as adrenaline. Here, this is responsible for emotional arousal as well as how we store memories, our metabolic and glucose levels, as far as when we're needing energy, that boost of energy. It's adrenaline or epinephrine that helps us. The next neurotransmitter, gamma aminobutyric acid, or just GABA. Here, this is helping with inhibitions, the neural inhibitions that's within the central nervous system. Think of it as that woo-saw calming effect because it's like tranquilizing drugs such as Valium, where increase in GABA would inhibit the effects, thereby it'll help to decrease anxiety. Okay, norepinephrine. Here, this looks at learning, memory, dreaming, emotions, as well as how we wake up from a sleep. It's associated with depression. It's been also associated, the higher levels have been associated with mania or agitation. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that's often seen as a mood stabilizer somewhat, and in terms of our sleep, appetite, it's been associated with helping with depression, pain suppression, and as you can read on, um, it's one of those, again, I call it the Wusa neurotransmitter.